Don't forget, as always, you can follow us on the social medias, Twitter, Moncton Wildcast, Instagram, Wildcast Podcast, TikTok, Wildcast Podcast, and of course, like and subscribe here on the YouTube, which we're going on a road trip.
We are.
So we should probably talk to the guy to finish our Maritime Division and set up the road trip.
Yes, do it.
All right.
I like it.
View from the other bench.
All right, our final stop in our preseason look around the Maritime Division, and it actually sets up perfectly as we're getting ready to open the season against them. That's the Cape Breton Eagles, and we are pleased to be joined by friend of the show with the second most appearances, Pat McNeil. Sir Pat, welcome back to Canada. Are you rested and ready for another season?
I rested, relatively speaking, I guess. Definitely, I think, getting close to ready. A little bit crestfallen with the news that I'm second in appearances. We might have to change that as the season goes on, but certainly doing podcasts like this definitely get you ramped up, but going to be a good season, particularly I think for our teams in the Maritime Division. Should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's I don't think you're much behind Jamie Tozer, but you are behind Jamie Tozer, so
Jamie is everywhere, so he's really tough to compete against.
That is true. So I guess I don't know how much of camp you've been around for or paying attention while you were down in Kentucky and all over the United States, but I guess just what's the atmosphere of what camp was like, and then getting into the season, the expectations. I mean, I think they're pretty high in Cape Breton.
Yeah, I didn't get to see a lot of camp action, but have been around the team a lot after the team was picked, and there's a good vibe in the team. Lou Robitaille obviously comes in, new head coach. There's new energy there, and it seems like the players are responding to him positively, which is good to see. You never know how that's going to go. He can be a demanding coach, but so far it seems like the players like being pushed, so it's good. And a lot of guys returning. If you look at the makeup of this team, I think one of the subtle stories of the offseason in Cape Breton is that this has truly become Sylvain Couturier's team, because he inherited a team that after the 2021-2022 season was obviously a rough year for the Eagles at the bottom of the league. In that offseason, he had to make a lot of moves to get younger to build the contend in the future, but then he had to go get some older, not so much stopgap, but veteran players to kind of fill the roster. This year, as opposed to the beginning of last season when you only had 7 returning players, this year you've got 13 guys returning, plus 3 of the rookies are affiliate players from last season. So the 2022 draft class kind of getting its time to shine. So it's obviously pieces coming in with Cole Burbage and Cam McDonald up front particularly, and you have 2 new imports as well. But I think as much of anything, you're looking at improvement from that returning core is part of the reason you have those high expectations you speak of. And I talked about it in the intro. You look at Cape Breton and Moncton, and I think Halifax obviously as well. Maybe a bit of a 3-headed monster there in the Maritimes, and it should be some good games between those 3 teams, not to take for granted games against any other teams, but I think the Eagles are optimistic of being in the mix and trying to fight for a division title.
Right.
Yeah, Adam and I saw a lot of you at the draft, Pat. And when I say a lot of you, we mean, of course, the back of your head.
And better view, right?
Yeah.
We were privileged to also be in a few of your interviews that you did with your draft picks, including Emile Ricard. It's actually a pleasant surprise, or a pleasant change, I guess you could say, to actually have a player excited to go to Cape Breton. I understand there's also an organizational connection to that pick. I guess if you could just tell us your overall thoughts on him so far, and as camp has progressed.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, excited to be in Cape Breton, brings a great energy to the team. It's going to be interesting to see how he adjusts, because he's somebody who doesn't like to shy away from physical play, and that might be a bit challenging at 16, especially he's a young 16 who's born in the fall. Grew up going to Voltigeur games, that kind of fancies himself after Andre Palat, who obviously he would have watched play with at Drummondville. One of the tie-ins you speak of is obviously he would have been drafted by Sylvain Couturier, and when Sean Couturier was drafted in the queue, he was drafted by Emile's father when Emile was the general manager of Drummondville. And of course, Sean Couturier, to further add to that story, was drafted at the draft in Cape Breton. So kind of a neat tie in there. It is going to be interesting to see what he does this season. I think he played center in the U18 ranks, probably going to be more relied upon on the wing, but I think he'll get some opportunity to succeed. And as I mentioned, didn't get a chance to see much game action of him, but certainly is coming to the rink with a smile on his face. He's the only 16-year-old on the team, so he's the one that's bringing the youth to this organization at the moment. And I think he's kind of chomping at the bit to get into it, and certainly we're excited to see what he brings on the ice at the major junior level.
So I like to talk goaltending. We've had it every year with the Eagles, with you, and it's always been a 1A, 1B situation. You've had Ruccia and De La Fonte. You've had Ruccia and Satney. Now you got Ruccia and Milata, who we saw him stop 51 of 54 shots or something like that a week ago. Is this Ruccia's net, and what's the confidence level behind him going into his third season?
I think it's 1A and 1B again, and the team has pretty much said as much. So Ruccia is the designated starter if there were one, but Sylvain Couturier and Louis Robitaille have both been vocal about just the way the Q schedule is, particularly with Cape Breton, and the team travels so much. There's a little bit of added fatigue there. Says that you really just can't rely on one goaltender, and I think as cliche as it is to say, that's becoming more of the case throughout the hockey world now, and the Eagles are not really any exception to that. Ruccia, obviously, the more experienced of the two goaltenders. And kind of an interesting story about Ruccia from my perspective. You guys would remember that he played the third period of that last game of the year in Moncton. The Eagles had won 4 straight games in Moncton, and the jig was up the last game of the season. The Eagles need a win to move up the standings, and they end up losing to the Cats. Shatney gets pulled after 2 periods, and it was a rough night for the Eagles. And I was thinking, well, the one silver lining in this is if Ruccia gets in and has a strong third, then he can get that save percentage up maybe close to or at 900. But unfortunately, it was just one of those nights where everything was going well for Moncton, so the opposite ended up happening. And poor Ruccia's save percentage went down a couple of notches in the third period. But I think he was probably pretty happy. Obviously, the playoffs were not successful for the team, but I think he was probably happy with a lot of the games we saw in the second half, particularly that game in Halifax, the second last game of the season, where he took a couple of valuable points for the Eagles. But he's obviously being pushed by a bit of an unknown. I say, you never really know how the imports are going to adapt to North America. Milata obviously looked really good at the U18s, and as you said, was very impressive in preseason action. So I think it's a scenario where Ruccia would be the designated starter by way of having experience, but he comes into camp knowing that he's got a guy looking over his shoulder, because obviously Milata's the future. Time will tell if he's the present as well. And certainly we'd love to see what he gave in the U18, but also would like to see some strong games from Ruccia like we saw in some of those games we saw in the second half. And his stat line is kind of improving every year, as goaltenders tend to do. Whether it improves enough for him to keep getting the load in the crease, well, that's why they play the games, and we'll have to wait and see.
Of course, it's a big season for Thomas Lavoie going into his NHL draft year. Do you expect him to, be a part of the leadership group this year in Cape Breton? And what sort of projection do you see him taking? Because statistically, people will say he didn't have the greatest season as a 16-year-old, but some will say that he actually had a really good 16-year-old season. So where do you see him, on the leadership group this season and statistically as well?
I think he'll have a voice in the dressing room. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Whether or not he would have a letter or not, there's a lot of returning players, particularly on the blue line. So I wouldn't say, although it wouldn't be shocking, it's possible. The big thing with Thomas is he really bulked up in the offseason. 6'4", 220 pounds. This is a big guy heading into his draft year. And as for his season last year, Jeremy, to your point, stats don't tell the whole story, particularly for a defenseman. He and a lot of the other Eagles defensemen who were playing last year were relied to play heavy minutes. It's interesting. The Eagles not only suffered a lot of injuries on defense last year, but it was a quirk that early in the season, they suffered a lot of injuries early game, which means that not only were guys moving up the chart, but they were playing a lot of minutes in games where the team only had 5D. So he was the recipient of that ice as much as anybody. You had both him and Xavier Degler, rookie defensemen, playing upwards of 25, 30 minutes. Obviously, a best defenseman is going to make mistakes in that scenario, much less a guy who's a rookie in the QMJHL. The offense, hopefully you see that come this year. It'll be interesting, though, because he might be a bit more insulated than you expect because of all the returning guys. Like Bigger comes back, Shortle, Schmidt. Certainly he's going to have his opportunity, but maybe that's also going to inspire him, the fact that he's not just fighting for a draft position. Top 4 ice on the back end is not always going to be guaranteed with all the other guys there, but I think the expectations are pretty high for him. And based on what we saw last year, he's not in first rounds of mocks yet. Maybe he could work his way up there, but I think there's a lot of excitement as to what he can bring this year. And as I said, he's certainly beefed up heading into this sophomore year of junior hockey.
So some of those returning guys that come back, they were part of the Eagles that went 6-3 in 9 games against us last year. And of course you've added, you added Braden Schmidt, but you've added Cam McDonald, you've added one of the bigger trades of the offseason in Cole Burbage. I guess just from a fan's perspective, is this a cup or bust year? Like, this is a have Sylvain push all in, or is this a year one of a 2-year window, learning to win in the playoffs? Because it's not easy to win in the playoffs. You got to learn how to do that. And Moncton did that last year with winning that first round series and then moving into Halifax. You got to learn that. So what is the fan expectation? Is it a Christmas that's going to be full of some moves and it's all in, or win a couple rounds and we're happy with that, and next year is kind of when we want to get to where we want to go?
I would say it's more the latter. Obviously, you're never happy with losing, but to use the window open analogy, it's almost like the team is opening up the window halfway with the intention of pushing it all the way open the next year. That's kind of one way I would look at it. There is an expectation and a need really for the team to have some playoff success. It's not a championship or bust, but this team needs to be pretty good right now. And I think the pieces are there, both from that internal development and also bringing in guys like McDonald and Burbage, and we'll see how the Europeans adapt with Stahan up front as well as Mulata and Nets. So there's definitely a hope that this is going to be a year where this team takes a step forward. Interesting because, maybe the true powerhouses of the league lie in the West, but I think the East might be a deeper conference. You take a look at what Quebec did last year. Obviously, they're vastly depleted, but all the teams right under Quebec are all teams that should come back pretty consistent to what they were last year. Yep. So with all the moves the Eagles made, they should be, at least able to keep pace, but they're going to get a push from everyone else. So it's going to be tough sledding in the Eastern Conference, but pretty fun to watch. And expectations are high in Cape Breton, as they should be. Fans pay money to go to games, so they should have high expectations. And they've been waiting a long time to see their team succeed in the playoffs. And I think the team is in position to do that this year to a degree. But as I said, there won't be many easy games in the East this year, so it should be a pretty fun year for a neutral fan. It might be frustrating for these good teams when they get in each other's way, but from a neutral fan, there should be some good games for sure.
Yep.
And that leads in perfectly to our final question, talking about the battle of the East and the West. We like to ask this to you pretty much every year, but if you could just maybe give us your prediction on the two teams who will face off against each other for the league championship.
That is a very good question, and oh boy, it's tough. I feel like the powers maybe in the West, we could be lined up for a Rouyn-Noranda Victoriaville final. That's kind of my first instinct. With Rouyn-Noranda, it's not so much the team that they have, although it is a very good team. It's the fact they made so many moves in the off season that you think, well, they're not fooling around. If they went out and got Langlois, Russo, Lashko, and Varro, and obviously Victoriaville was sort of setting the table. We don't know if Frederic Brunet is going to be back this year, but there's still a lot of pieces there. So those are the two teams that kind of stick out in my head. But Halifax, it's really going to be interesting to see how much of their success was dependent on Doucette and Lawrence last year. There's that outside chance Jordan Dumais makes the NHL. That obviously throws a lot of wrinkles into things. And, as I said, Halifax is going to get pushed by the Eagles. They're going to get pushed by Moncton. They'll get pushed by Rimouski and Baie-Comeau as well. Probably throw Chicoutimi in there. So they would be the team, though, I'm kind of most looking at. And then Drummondville as well is going to be interesting, although they kind of have a core that hasn't been where they've wanted the last few years. But, head coaching changed there, so it could be time. Instinctively, my first gut reaction would be Rouyn and Victoriaville, but I think there might be maybe more depth in the league this year. I don't envision anybody walking to a title. And as I said, I think that should make for some pretty fun hockey for fans to watch.
Well, that went 5 sweep for Rouyn.
Mm-hmm.
So at least Rouyn the expectations are there. And you know what?
I will say this, though, Adam. I think a lot of that is just based on the fact they made so many moves. And this is not discrediting the players that are coming back, but I don't see that roster as being heads above the rest of the league. Don't get me wrong. A lot of good pieces, a really good team, but there's going to be some good competition in this league, and they're going to have to work for every win they get.
Absolutely. And like I said, Rouyn is there, and we're not going to hold you to this prediction. We will give you a chance, like we've given everyone a chance to come back on the trade deadline shows. And because that's going to affect a lot of things. There's injuries. There's teams playing to expectations. There's team not playing. So we'll let you come back and change your prediction if you want at the trade deadline show, if that works for you.
Always. I very much appreciate the opportunity to not look like a fool, which is not always easy in this game, as you guys know.
No, it's stay away from technology and you'll be fine.
Yeah, that's probably a good first step. First good advice. A lot of aspects.
Yeah. Speaking of fools, really looking forward to our trip to Cape Breton this weekend.
Yes, and this will be, I guess, breaking news for those listening. The tentative plans are to feature Adam and Jeremy on the air live on Saturday, and hopefully we can repurpose some of this audio for Friday's broadcast. Definitely looking forward to seeing you guys at Center 200, and I look forward to the post-podcast as well, not just your impressions on the two teams, but also your impressions of the Center 200 experience, as it were.
I'm looking forward to the post-game celebrations.
Yeah, we've dug into the post-game scenarios with you, and my last question to you, I was a little sad to find out there's no, let's call them adult establishments in Nova Scotia.
Yes,
but we're just pumped to both visit the Center 200 for the first time, and just experience that. And again, like I said to Corey last week, I mean, this show can't progress the way it has without you guys in the media treating us with respect and coming on and giving us the time. So yeah, we're definitely excited to get to Cape Breton next Friday.
Well, happy to do so. Happy to have you guys and happy to be on the show as well. I think it's reciprocated because it's good to have people who take on their own project and show enthusiasm for the league. And if people are going to be enthusiastic about covering the league, that's not something that should be turned down. I think the Cats, they should be thankful that you guys are giving them a lot of good free publicity. I know you guys are cranking out the player interviews and all that. It's good stuff. So definitely looking forward to see what your impressions are of Sydney, because I know you've had the chance to go to some of the other rinks. But it's funny because of the way distance works. Moncton is a close opponent for us, but we're a far opponent for you. So a bit more of a adventurous road trip for you to come to Cape Breton, and maybe you can take route 125 on the way down and route 4 on the way back, so you see both sides of the Redor Lakes and have a good time during your weekend, both off and on the ice, away from the rink.
Yeah,
noted.
I mean, on the ice doesn't depend on what we do. That's for sure. But it's exciting. I think it was supposed to happen last year too. Is back-to-back games on opening weekend, and I think that's something they should do all the time. Whether it's go there or come here, just establish that back-to-back rivalry on open weekend and set things up. But yeah, again, thanks for taking the time to talk to us, man, and we'll see you Friday.
Thanks, guys. Look forward to it. Last note I'll say, sometimes these back-to-back games, they don't look like each other at all. So what you see Friday, don't necessarily expect to see Saturday, but I do expect good games and look forward to seeing you guys as well. Thanks again.
Yeah, no problem, Pat.